Welcome everybody to this to the OTI's webinar. I'm really excited to have this talk about gender in treatment of gender dysphoria and how that's changed by a recent Supreme Court ruling and recent research findings. This is a really interesting time for unpacking that issue. I wanted to take a quick minute to talk a little bit about Open Therapy Institute for people in the audience that aren't familiar with us or aren't familiar with what we do. My kind of short personal story about what led me to found Open Therapy Institute was that when I was in graduate school, I saw the training of mental health practitioners, therapists especially, becoming more and more politicized, like in other fields in higher ed that people have seen. And it was really got to the point where there were multiple trainings a week with really hard-edged identity politics activism in them. It kind of, for me, culminated at a group supervision that I did where one of the therapists said that she hated her patient, not because of anything that he said or did, but just because he was a white male. And of course, the response in the room was, we totally understand why you feel that way and think you're brave and courageous for having said it. That she was later promoted and all of this. And I realized at the time that if I was looking, I was very lucky to have a psychoanalyst at the time who understood the strain that these issues can place on people. But I realized that if I was looking for a therapist for a friend or a colleague who had a similar experience, I wouldn't know where to look. And I know that similar types of trainings and workplace cultures happen in other professions and other fields, the arts, performing arts, entertainment industry, and education and law, finance. And I didn't know where any of these people would be able to find a therapist. And I started to think the field is becoming so biased that it's hard for people to find a therapist if they're concerned about men's issues or masculinity, if they're conservative, if they're religious, or if they're concerned about a number of issues, including gender. And so that's what led to the creation of Open Therapy Institute, was wanting to have a place where anybody could find a therapist that was attuned to their values, and they wouldn't have to kind of hunt or try therapist after therapist to figure out whether or not they're going to be attuned to them. So if you're new to Open Therapy Institute, I encourage you to go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. If you're a therapist, become a member. We have weekly peer consultation groups and a conference coming up. If you're not and you're looking for a therapist, just click the Find a Therapist button and we can find you somebody who's licensed in your state. Today's talk is really exciting to me because I think gender is one of the places where we're seeing the most change. When I started my doctorate, very few people knew very much about gender dysphoria. It was hard to find somebody with expertise on it, and it wasn't unusual for your abnormal psych class to not even have any material at all on the issue. And I was in the profession at a university when there was this culture shift that was happening nationally, that it was kind of announced in the media that the field had this rigorous consensus that anybody, no matter what their age, if they indicated gender dysphoria, they should be encouraged to rapidly pursue medical interventions. And if you were a therapist and you wanted to know what's the evidence for this, is this really the best practice? You could expect to be accused of being a bigot and maybe even face other professional consequences. So it spread really fast throughout the profession without a lot of vetting. And it does seem like now some of that is being rolled back, including in this recent Supreme Court ruling that just came out, Childs v. Salazar. So not to overbake the issue, I think therapists right now are really confused about how to treat people that come into their office reporting gender dysphoria, maybe especially kids. A lot of therapists, I think, don't want to touch it because they're worried that if they ask challenging questions or share information the patient doesn't want to hear, they're going to be accused of, you know, of um, not doing affirmative care, and then they'll lose their license or face other types of professional sanction. And so they're hesitant to engage with this population at all. That might be shifting now with this recent Supreme Court ruling. I don't want to summarize it because Ilya Shapiro is here and he can summarize it better than I can. But I think I'm hoping that for anybody who's a mental health professional or interested in this issue, we can kind of clarify today what the current state of the law is, including what's clear and what's not clear, and what the current state of the evidence is in terms of what we know and what we don't have data on, and have kind of a short primer on those things so that therapists can um, feel more grounded when these issues come up in their practice. So without further discussion, Ilya, can you come back on? So I have here Ilya Shapiro. Um, Ilya is a constitutional law scholar and the director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. He's written extensively on the Supreme Court and the First Amendment, filed over 500 amicus briefs before the court, and previously served as executive director at Georgetown Law's Center for the Constitution. And he has a new book, which you can see behind him as well. And thank you so much for joining us. Tell us what we need to know about this case.
Great. Well, thanks, Andrew, for having me. I think Open Therapy Institute is very important. As I read, as a layman about the field of psychology and psychiatry, I'm just keep getting surprised by some of these things that have happened in the last decade, and so I think this is necessary work. Um, the Childs case. Let me give you some background because I don't assume that anybody on this call has read the Supreme Court opinion. So Kaylee Childs is a licensed counselor whose clients seek help on gender dysphoria and sexuality. And these include clients who are happy with their gender identity or sexual orientation, and those who want to change sexual behaviors or, as she put it, grow in the experience of harmony with their bodies. In 2019, Colorado, which is where she lives and works, enacted a law stopping licensed counselors from engaging in quote unquote conversion therapy, defined as practices or treatments that attempt to change sexual orientation or gender identity or quote eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attraction or feelings towards individuals of the same sex. The law allows practices that provide acceptance and support for the quote facilitation of an individual's identity, exploration, and development. Childs filed a challenge before being sued or prosecuted or anything, a pre-enforcement challenge, what's called, as applied to her practice, which is solely talk therapy. She argued that the law dictates what she may say about gender and sexuality, and so is a First Amendment violation. The district court and the Court of Appeals, the 10th Circuit, held that she had standing but denied her an injunction characterizing the law as regulating professional conduct that only incidentally affects speech. And so the issue came before the Supreme Court. The question was whether a law that censors certain conversations between counselors and their clients based on the viewpoints expressed, specifically over sexual orientation and gender identity, regulates conduct or regulates speech in violation of the First Amendment. Now, these facts seem like the inverse of a case that came up last term, the previous term, Scrimeti out of Tennessee, where about half the states ban medical and surgical interventions for gender dysphoria. But it actually turned out not to be the flip side of that because it was a speech, it was a First Amendment issue, not discrimination, which was the issues raised in Scrimeti based on sex and sexual orientation. In any event, the court ultimately ruled 8-1 in an opinion by Justice Gorsuch, reversing the lower courts, saying that the law restricting what licensed counselors can say to their clients about gender violates the First Amendment. Quote, the question before us is a narrow one. Childs challenged only the quote application of the law that strikes at the heart of the First Amendment's protections for free speech. And so, applying a heightened judicial scrutiny, the court concluded that the courts below failed to apply sufficiently rigorous First Amendment analysis in the case. Childs engages only in the quintessential form of protected speech, and Colorado seeks to regulate the content of Childs' speech as well as what views she may and may not express. So, focusing only on licensed professions or licensed healthcare professions changed nothing. Justice Kagan, joined by Sotomayor, wrote a concurrence saying that the First Amendment question would have been different and harder if Colorado had instead enacted a content-based but viewpoint-neutral law. Like, let's say Colorado said, you can't talk about gender dysphoria at all. If you have a patient coming to you with these issues, you cannot accept them. You can't talk to them at all. That would be a different question. So, in short, the ruling was about viewpoint discrimination. You can talk in a way that affirms gender transition, but you can't explore whether there are comorbidities or other mental illness underlying this gender dysphoria. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was the lone dissent, and she said that this is a regulation of conduct, basically agreeing with the lower court that all that the state is doing here is restricting a dangerous therapy modality that incidentally involves provider speech. Again, that she was the solo dissent. And I should note that the Manhattan Institute, my organization, filed a brief supporting Childs and representing the interests of Jewish and Muslim therapists. Now, the first thing I'd emphasize after Childs is that the decision is important, but it's not a complete deregulation of therapy. It doesn't say that anything a licensed professional says in a therapy room is immune from professional discipline, malpractice liability, informed consent rules, or ordinary standards of care. What it does say is that the state may not evade the First Amendment by relabeling viewpoint-based restrictions on talk therapy as mere regulation of professional conduct. In Childs, the court treated Colorado's law as viewpoint discriminatory because it allowed counseling, as I said, that supported identity exploration or transition, but not that aimed at helping a client pursue a different goal. So the lesson is not that therapists are now legally free to push patients in whatever direction they prefer. The lesson is something like, and again, I'm interested to hear what Colin says about this, that the state cannot prescribe the therapeutic conclusion in advance. So a counselor can't coerce, shame, deceive, abandon ordinary clinical judgment, or otherwise practice outside their competence. You can still run into trouble there. But a counselor also can't be turned into an agent of state orthodoxy. So the constitutional value isn't conversion therapy, so-called, it's client-centered, open-ended conversation. And that matters especially because the science and clinical practice around gender dysphoria isn't frozen. Serious institutions disagree about how to describe the evidence, how much caution is warranted. In the United States, the American Psychological Association, the American Association of Pediatrics continue to endorse access to evidence-based gender-affirming care while also acknowledging the need for accurate information. And in the AAP's case, an expanded systematic review of evidence. At the same time, the Cass review in England called for a more holistic, cautious model for children and adolescents and emphasized gaps in the evidence base. So the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, has since made puberty blockers unavailable as routine treatment for minors outside research settings. So that combination, constitutional protection for speech, continuing professional regulation, and unsettled or contested evidence, puts therapists in a difficult position. I imagine that's why a lot of you have tuned into this webinar. You need freedom to ask questions, but you also need humility. You need protection from ideological licensing rules, but you also need to document carefully, screen for comorbidities, respect client self-determination, involve parents appropriately when minors are involved, and avoid promising certainty where the evidence doesn't provide it. So my hope for today's conversation is that we resist two temptations. One is the temptation to say that Childs settles everything. It doesn't. The other is the temptation to replace one mandated script with another. So the better path is a professional culture in which clinicians can explore without fear, patients aren't rushed towards any predetermined outcome, and the law protects the conditions for honest therapy rather than dictating any destination. So put simply, Childs should be understood as a free speech ruling, not a clinical guideline. It protects talk therapy from viewpoint-based state censorship while leaving ordinary professional obligations very much in place. It opens space for careful, ethical, evidence-based therapy. What therapists do with that space is a different, harder question and one beyond my expertise. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ilya. Um, that's a great summary. And I'm gonna invite Colin back, and he's gonna share some remarks about the state of evidence. And Ilya, we can turn our cameras back off.
Awesome. So I'm really glad to be here for the Open Therapy Institute. It's a good opportunity to discuss a lot of the complex issues that are surrounding this because, a lot of the legal stuff, frankly, I get hung up on it too. And if you haven't been just following the evidence base for, the last decade or so, it's easy to not know, like, where do we currently stand on all of this? So I'll go over some of this and sort of maybe how I think how it fits within the child's ruling. So one thing that I've been approached to by a lot of therapists over the years. Maybe the biggest question or the biggest concern was that a lot of therapists felt they were in this kind of double bind situation. So many children and adolescents who identify as trans, they are same-sex attracted. And so if therapists did not affirm their cross-sex identity, then that could be, framed as gender identity conversion therapy. But if therapists did affirm their cross-sex identity, if they followed the gender-affirming care clinical guidelines, then this same-sex attracted child could plausibly, this intervention could function as a kind of gay conversion therapy because you're taking this same-sex attracted kid, you're saying, actually, you're born in the wrong body, and that sort of in a way makes them straight, at least in the minds of a lot of the activists. So one side said, not affirming could be called anti-trans conversion therapy. The other side thought that affirming could effectively reinforce the idea that these sort of gay individuals or same-sex attracted kids are born in the wrong body. And that contradiction really mattered a lot because it revealed how kind of unstable that affirm-only framework was. So a lot of therapists just felt kind of frozen because they didn't know what to do because they would just, they're surrounded by these potentially legal tripwires where they could conceivably lose their license either way. And I think was especially concerning for a lot of Canadian therapists as well because they, I think, have a lot of these conversion therapy bans. So my understanding of the Childs ruling is that it does protect pure talk therapy and prevents the government from banning therapeutic viewpoint because just certain government officials disapprove of it. This is, I think, an important aspect, and I think it's a good part of the ruling. It involves asking questions. You can now test assumptions. You can explore causes, underlying causes of the potential distress, to help people understand where this distress is coming from. Because if the state can ban one side of that whole discussion, it becomes more like this ideological enforcement than any sort of investigation of clinical care. So therapists, they have more freedom to practice this kind of open-ended exploratory therapy without coming under fire for gender identity conversion therapy. So a clinician can now ask, why is this child distressed? Is this dysphoria connected to things like trauma or anxiety? Or, we know that there's a high correlation with people who are on the autism spectrum, on the autism spectrum, whether or not they have depression. Are they bullying? Is it a result of internalized homophobia, to steal like a left-wing term that a lot of detransitioners have expressed to me that this was, they ultimately realized that they were gay and they wanted to suppress that aspect. And so to become straight, they would sort of take on this cross-sex identities. So yeah, so that was a major aspect of this whole thing. But then some people looking at the Childs ruling notices that it could be a double-edged sword because the ruling also means that gender-affirming talk therapy is also fair game, which a lot of the gender critical crowd rightfully speaks out against because gender-affirming care, the first step isn't really medical, it's linguistic and social. It's using a new name. These people come to you wanting you to use their new name. It's using, cross-sex or non-binary pronouns that have no biological referent whatsoever. It's using this affirming language in their new, identity that conflicts with the sex they are. And then this is recognized by parents, teachers, and therapists, and even all the students in their classes. So this is usually presented as a harmless first step by a lot of the activists, but it really isn't neutral at all because, as Ken Zucker has shown with his research, a social transition, even though it might just be kind of an aspect of talk therapy, is really a psychosocial intervention. It can make what would normally be a temporary, ephemeral phase that some kids going through, a cross-sex identity, it can make it more solidified. And upwards of 95 to 97% of kids who receive who are affirmed in their cross-sex identity from an early age will go on to take cross-sex hormones and potentially pursue surgeries. Whereas we know that 80+% of kids who are just merely left alone and not affirmed will naturally desist. Okay. So this kind of changed the ruling, has that double-edged sword aspect, but the terrain has now changed with the Childs ruling, I think. So the gender affirming, or sorry, the gender critical people have always kind of said that if we're allowed to talk openly about this stuff, then we're going to win because we have the better arguments. So we've now shifted, I think, more towards this battle of ideas and evidence and what the professional standards should be. And I think this is a massive win for us because we have a major advantage here. We don't have to, twist any evidence or bury our heads or, use pure ideological terms. We just need to adhere to the best available evidence, what the evidence actually says here. But then this is an area that's being exploited by activists as well, because they know that a lot of therapists are really busy, giving therapy to their clients. They don't have time to read the primary medical literature. And so they usually rely on medical organizations to, look at the evidence base for them and develop these clinical guidelines that therapists can then use with reasonable confidence that they are giving evidence-based, care, therapy to their patients. But we cannot rely on these medical guidelines anymore. And I can't stress that enough because the delta between what many organizations claim and the actual evidence is massive. In one big systematic review, it showed that the clinical guidelines that they're created, they're not based on original empirical research. It's just basically a citation cartel where everyone started citing WPATH, and then the Endocrine Society started, citing them, and then other groups started citing the Endocrine Society, and it just went in this big circle where the buck didn't stop anywhere, and it certainly didn't stop in the empirical literature. So therapists have to get familiar with the actual scientific literature because they cannot count on the professional guidelines anymore. I think that's just a major takeaway here. Yeah, the organizations cannot be trusted to deliver the goods here and adhere to evidence-based medicine. They're relying on this pseudo consensus. They're saying all these medical organizations agreed, look at their public statements. But what matters really shouldn't be what an organization happens to state, especially if it's out of sync with the evidence, which it is. So fortunately, parents have options now. They don't have to affirm automatically. Therapists, they have more room to explore rather than just immediately, affirm these children's cross-sex identity. Clinicians can discuss uncertainty and the risk and desistance and social influence and all those types of things. But the last thing I'll just mention here, which I think a lot of therapists have concerns with, is that, okay, maybe the legal barriers have weakened significantly. They're not going to get fired, but there's still a lot of social and professional barriers that remain to, a non-affirming therapist, because a therapist who doesn't immediately affirm, they're still going to be smeared as bigots, and they're still going to be accused of causing harm to people. So, and the children, if you're giving therapy to a child, they've often been heavily indoctrinated into sort of an ideology, gender ideology, for many years, and they're going to shut down the moment that a therapist calls into question, the gender identity narrative that they've built up for themselves. And this is the sole cause of all of their distress. So in a way, like, the activists have poisoned the well, I think, a lot on this topic, where, non-affirming exploratory therapy is just labeled beforehand as abusive before any sort of session even begins. So I can direct some therapists to an article written by Joe Burgo. He wrote it on my Substack. Is good because, the way that activists have framed the issue, it precludes a type of therapeutic exploration that is really important. And so it requires a really nuanced approach by therapists because, you don't want to lose the patients that are coming there who have been indoctrinated into, this gender identity, brain sex ideas, because they're often, the kids who need really good clinicians who aren't just going to affirm them right off the bat. They need responsible evidence-based therapists as well. But if you're immediately just, using sort of gender critical language, you might lose them. So I don't know how to guide therapists on this point. I think that's something maybe to speak with therapists who are experienced dealing with patients like this, who are really familiar with the data, and sort of being this sort of gender critical type person while dealing with patients who may be varying degrees of involved in activism. And so I think that's kind of where we are right now. We can talk more about evidence as we proceed in this, but that's kind of where I want to end it for now.
Okay. Thanks so much, Colin. That was really helpful. And um, yeah, and I also really appreciate the last point that you made, which is like from an actual practicing therapist perspective, there's the question of what are you legally allowed to do? And then there's the question of what does the data currently say? What do we know and not know? And then there is this other third piece that we're not talking about, which is how then do you use that in a clinically skilled way? In all the complex situations that actually arise in real therapies. And so it's an incredibly challenging area to practice in. My first question I wanted to is actually for Ilya, and I basically it's a big question, but essentially my understanding is state bans on conversion therapy in this area are effectively not constitutional. Um, what about being sued? What about professional bodies sanctioning you, licensure bodies having disciplinary procedures? What about getting fired from a clinic where you work? Is that stuff still up in the air, or are you protected in those domains as well? So it's like being sued, being fired, and then I guess professional bodies.
Um, Malpractice cases, malpractice law is all based on standard of care. Have you violated the standard of care? So I have no idea what that is based on the relevant regulatory body and best practices and all of that. Um, uh, if there are plenty of things that don't violate the law that might get you in trouble with your regulatory body, and it might differ by state for that matter. Um,
Okay.
so
So
that's
it's a
in
separate.
terms of firing. Most people are employed at will unless you have a contract that specifies that you have certain protections, and in which case your boss can fire you for basically anything other than certain civil rights protected categories, your race, your sex, etc. But speech is not protected in at-will employment. Now, if you're employed by the federal government or in a VA hospital or something, that's something different, or more by a state agency. But for private employers, where your boss can fire you for any reason or no reason at all, yeah, that's obviously still a danger.
So and so um, with professional bodies or malpractice or things like that, the standards of care could potentially include bans on conversion therapy. This ruling doesn't touch that question. Is that?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The First Amendment protects against government censorship. So I mean, it's an interesting question because the regulatory body, to the extent it's an arm of the state, that might be an issue. But if it's purely private, then yeah, it can do various things, including things that might be speech restrictive that don't touch on the First Amendment.
Okay. It's sobering, but thanks for clarifying that issue. And I guess the other piece related to this is like because the way the ruling came down, where it's about protecting free speech, it seems like there's an angle on this that could actually protect um, pro-trans therapists in the sense that no red state could ban affirming talk therapy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Um, Okay. And then another question that I'm curious what we have.
I mean, here's the thing.
Yeah.
You got me thinking just now. Uh, a license is, what you need to do to practice your profession. If you practice without a license, then that can be even a crime, which the state enforces. So there could be First Amendment issues if uh, these regulatory bodies, which have, they have real teeth, like you can't practice without it. You know, so I mean, again, I'm not a medical malpractice lawyer. I imagine it would work the same way it does in other medical fields where certain procedures or drugs might be indicated for certain things in some states but not in others.
Well, maybe the what is unsettled currently? Like are there remaining legal questions that haven't been answered related to this that would, and maybe the licensing would be an issue that might even need to be litigated?
It could. I mean, there's no constitutional questions with respect to state action. Um, I mean, at a certain point, if it's, can you lose your license for unprofessional extramural speech, right? I don't know.
Yes.
Let's say you say like various inflammatory things in a blog or in a TV appearance or something like that. Can you lose your license for that for being unprofessional or something like that? Uh, something to consider.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. And actually, for everybody who's in attendance, you can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can hit, if you don't see it, you can hit more, and there's a Q&A button there too. So please send in questions while we're talking, and I'll try to incorporate those. Um, so Colin, what's your sense of the current evidence base for the affirming care model of treatment? Is it, would you say there's not a lot of evidence, so we don't know? It clearly shows harm. There's not sufficient evidence to justify it. How would you frame that?
I would say that, over the years, beginning, I think in 2019, I think is when some of the first systematic reviews were coming out on this topic. The claim that we were up against wasn't one of nuance at all. It was this affirm only model where they were just coming out saying that the science has been settled on this. This stuff is life-saving medical care that is medically necessary. That's how they use to justify, insurance covering all of these. Um, but really, all of the systematic evidence reviews that have come out, which is a lot at this point. So we had, the Finland, they had a Cohere review. There was the UK NICE review in 2021. Sweden, WPATH even had their own systematic review, but then a lot of issues arose with that because they enacted more control over which bits of evidence was going to be published, which initially there was, they wanted to be transparent. And so subsequent systematic reviews that had looked at that, they rank the WPATH systematic review lower just because, the transparency it was just basically highly selective on what type of results they wanted to show. That relied heavily on just short-term follow-up data, that type of thing. Norway has systematic reviews. We had the major CAS review that came out, which, had had 7 of its own systematic reviews, one of which was, talking about the citation cartels that I mentioned, where all the organizations making their policy statements were just citing each other instead of the original research. McMaster's had a bunch of reviews that were come out that were, funded by SEGM and some other organizations. And then we just had the big HHS report, which was this umbrella review, sort of a systematic review of systematic reviews. And it really, I mean, all of these converge on the exact same conclusions that the evidence base for all these claims that, these are life-saving, for all of the claims, whether it's hormones that are leading to better, outcomes in terms of depression or anxiety, whether suicidal ideation is going down or completed suicides, this is the part of the life-saving thing. All of the claims have just been literally systematically evaluated and shown that there's just not good evidence to support any of these. We even saw Chase Strangio, the ACLU lawyer, when they were, trying to use the language of suicide, would you rather have a dead X or alive Y a child, in front of the Supreme Court justices, basically admitted that, actually that's kind of a lie. And thankfully that, completed suicides are extremely rare. And so they're just using a lot of these activist talking points in order to try to drive this gender affirming model, even when the evidence isn't there. And that's only just showing that, the burden of proof that, is the evidence good or is it not, that it's very poor, that it has benefits. But then there's the other side, because you can't just focus on the benefits. Well, what about the harms? And there's just a huge laundry list of known harms. I mean, if you're a biological male, you're prepubescent, and you take puberty blockers, and then that's followed up by cross-sex hormones, you will be sterile for the rest of your life. You're never going to be able to have children. And so that's a very significant harm, because the vast majority of people want to have children, and they've done surveys on these on the boys who identify as women. Most of them say they want to have children as well, but most of them don't pursue any fertility preservation, because it's very expensive. It's very time consuming, especially for males. It's super invasive. But even the females aren't pursuing these types of things. So yeah, I mean, the evidence, I don't think it could be clearer in terms of, there's no good evidence to support the extreme claims that are being made by the gender affirming side. And really, that's all what we need to do, because, we don't need to show like massive amounts of harm, even though we have that. It's sufficient enough in evidence-based medicine just to say all the claims that you're making for why this is good just do not hold up under any type of intense scrutiny when you actually look at the evidence. So, yeah, I think we're in a very good place if you want to dive into the actual evidence here. All the evidence is on our side. If you look at like the evidence pyramid, systematic reviews are the tippity top, because it actually looks at all of the studies and weights the evidence in a really systematic way, where you don't have to just go off, the policy statement of the Endocrine Society or, one-off studies that a lot of activists try to cite. You can say, well, according to all of these systematic evidence reviews, the evidence just isn't there. And that really should be the end of the conversation, even though they've now just pivoted to all major medical organizations agree that it's life-saving, even though they're not based on the actual evidence. So we really, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot rely on the policy positions by medical organizations. We have to get familiar with the empirical literature on here. And it's overwhelmingly on the side of caution, not pursuing gender affirming care, more exploratory therapy, that type of thing.
Well, I do think that's one of the lessons here, is like that most of the public doesn't understand that these professional associations are, voluntary participation by people in a given field, and they're really susceptible to be taken over by motivated activists. I think this happens in every professional organizations,
Yeah.
And then they can release statements as if they're speaking for the whole profession that even people in the field don't agree with. But just to kind of follow up on that, are there specific studies that you feel like you would really like to see done or are missing, or do you kind of feel like that's not the case? Is there specific evidence that you'd be looking for, or studies that you would want to see happen, or not, or nothing comes to mind?
I mean, there are some types of, evidence I would like to see just to fill in certain gaps. I think, we don't have good evidence on, what is the actual desistance rate for children who have taken puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in various stages. What's the sort of attrition rate for all these steps? The data actually does exist out there. I think there's the gender clinics in the GIDS in the UK. But when the cash review happened, these gender clinics, they didn't turn over the long-term data they had because they had actually tracked a lot of these kids who from the first appointment to what they are doing now a decade later or even longer. And this is data that's just being held in their, close to them behind their backs because, a lot of times they don't want people to know what this is because it might, reveal something that is not totally consistent with the narrative of gender affirming care. And then, so those are just sort of more data, like, what are the actual numbers? What are the actual rates? In the US, it's difficult because we have like the private clinics, we have the public healthcare data, and it's really difficult. We have active fraud of, this is what Texas Children's Hospital is being, or was recently being pursued for. That I think they had to pay $10 million because they were actively just using incorrect billing codes in order to keep doing these gender affirming procedures when they said they weren't going to do it. And the people I talked to is that this sort of billing code fraud is completely rampant. So they'll call it like an endocrine disorder when no such disorder exists. They just use it as a justification to give a young girl testosterone or a young boy estrogen, that type of thing. But then there's also, there was a big puberty blockers study that was going to go on in the UK that I believe got canceled at the last moment because people are saying like, well, we know that this puberty blockers is going to make kids more likely to desist. Is it actually ethical to do some of these types of studies when we don't see any evidence of benefit for these at all? What are we actually gaining by subjecting a bunch of adolescents, even in a clinical trial, and it's all sciencey, to interventions that we know is going to sterilize a large proportion of them? Like, is it actually ethical to do this? I don't think it is in many cases. So, yeah, there's information that I want to know that is out there that's sort of just filling in the gaps, and there's information that I guess I'd like to know, but then it's unethical to do this type of thing. I don't think we need to have any more information in terms of outcomes. I think we have a lot of that with the systematic reviews. I really think we need to shift the conversation, whether, away from, what is the evidence of benefit or harm for this, to really looking at the foundational premise of these procedures in general, because they're premised on this idea that an individual can have a brain sex or the gender identity that is mismatched from their biological sex, and that sex is this mutable spectrum that you can move if you just modify, secondary sex characteristics with hormones or surgeries, or, blocking their development to begin with. And it's just the whole premise is rooted in complete pseudoscience. So we know that it doesn't help people on the back end, given the evidence that we have. We know the premise is completely fraudulent. It just doesn't match biological reality. I don't think we need much more in terms of studies. We just need to I think stop pursuing this type of thing because through and through, I just don't think the evidence is there.
Okay, I mean, I want to ask one last question, then we've got a lot coming through from the audience, but same question for both of you, respective to your areas of expertise. What would you most want practicing therapists to know? I guess first you, Ilya, about the legal issues under consideration here, and then Colin about the evidence base.
Sure. Use your best judgment. You can, if someone wants to take you to court for doing something that you in your professional opinion think is correct, I don't see how you're going to lose. I think this goes to the one of the questions that I was just looking through in the Q&A. Someone talked about the W path standard of care, and there's one that's requires reflexive affirmation and automatic
Actually,
omission of.
let me go ahead and read that one, and
Sure.
if you want to respond to it. So, is a correct understanding that the WPATH standards of care are impermissible under Childs because they require reflexive affirmation and automatic omission of gender critical perspectives? And if this is the case, should healthcare or organizations and school-based health entities be concerned about legal exposure of relying on those WPATH standards?
So it's not that, which is kind of what you were asking earlier, Andrew, about consequences from regulatory bodies and such. It's not that the WPATH standard of care is impermissible under Childs, because after all, WPATH is a private professional guideline, not a statute or a licensing rule. But to the extent that that guideline is incorporated into law or licensing discipline or school policy or other, Medicaid rules, grant conditions, any sort of government-related institutional protocol in a way that requires clinicians to affirm gender identity while forbidding open-ended exploration, or skepticism about transition or patient-led desistance goals, then that kind of implementation raises serious child's problems. So, um, I think licensing boards are going to have to grapple with this. As in a time of uncertainty with evidentiary flux, if you're saying that notwithstanding any state laws that don't forbid talk therapy open-ended, you're going to say that you are forbidding it. Well, that comes close to having some actionable claim by the therapist that you're using coercive power to restrict their evidence-based practice.
Yeah. So actually, the Child's ruling, you couldn't ban the WPATH standards, presumably for talk therapy. No state could do that because that would input. Is that right?
Right, right. That's right.
Um, okay. And then going back to that previous question, Colin, about what would you most want therapists to know that where they might have a misconception about the evidence base here?
I think therapists need to be comfortable knowing that the evidence is actually on the side of skepticism and slowing things down and not affirming uh, their clients. You get a lot of activists that are going to come at you and throw individual papers at you, funded by WPATH or whatever. And it's important to just really lean into the systematic evidence reviews, lean into the evidence pyramid, where systematic reviews sit at the very top. They're going to try to accuse you of all sorts of things, of, political motivations, religious motivations, whatever it's going to be, as the reason that you're not administering this care, or, supposed care right off the bat. But really, if we just lean into the actual evidence, it's on your side. But then, as I mentioned before, you need to also bring your expertise as a therapist too, because the kids who need to be not affirmed are probably the kids who want it the most and who've been indoctrinated the most on this. So it's going to really take a highly nuanced approach. You're going to have to use your best, um, you know, therapeutic experience, call on your experience as a therapist and individualized approaches to each patient that you have, in order to try to give them the best care that you have. But you can just lean into the evidence, and say, this isn't your opinion. You're not doing this because you like or dislike anything about it. This is just merely what is the result of, many independently performed systematic evidence reviews by, Scandinavian countries that aren't exactly bastions of hyper conservatism. So people need to be confident in going into these, that the evidence is actually on their side.
Yeah. I would also just say for therapists that are thinking about what this actually means for their practice, and I think you mentioned Joe Burgo's work, and I think this is a discussion that needs to be had about what therapists actually should do. I think Joe has said that really prioritizing the therapeutic relationship, especially with the kid, is the top priority, even if that, means letting things go or not challenging things that you might not agree with. The focus is on a strong, trusting therapeutic relationship. And the rest can come later to the extent it might, you might have a role at all, but pushing too hard wouldn't work. And I think there are precedents that we're not going to go into today about things like motivational interviewing or other types of supportive approaches that could potentially work. But I think that literature seems pretty nascent. I did have there's another question here, which is one that I had, which is for both of you. And it's where do you see the next 5 to 10 years heading, um, in terms of evidence coming in, maybe new studies. But I think another one, and maybe we'll start with this, Ilya, is on the legal side. Do you anticipate new legal challenges that could have new justifications for banning so-called conversion therapy? Do you anticipate the ground could shift again, or do you think this is pretty settled?
Um, well, it's at the risk of repeating the same thing for the third time, because it's going to be about any regulatory body that decides to take action against a therapist, if they would even want to do that. Because the thing is, if the patient is happy with the therapist, then where is the complaint going to come from? Where is the lawsuit going to come from? Um, is it somebody who has severe mental illness and is counseled and eventually commits suicide, and then the parents sue, or relatives sue? Doesn't have to be a minor, could be, other relatives. Um, Maybe. And then again, we're going to fight over this standard of care stuff. Um, but something like that probably wouldn't reach the Supreme Court. I don't know. Again, this really goes into medical malpractice stuff, and how allegations of malpractice in talk therapy work. I don't know how often such suits even happen when someone's under a therapist's care, forget gender stuff, just in general, under a therapist's care, commits suicide, and then their family sues. What has to be established to prove liability in that sort of case? I think we're going to go through, that's the most likely kind of parallel.
I see. Yeah. Um, Colin, anything? I mean, you did talk about this a little bit too, but I don't know if there's anything you see coming down the road in the next 5 to 10 years that you're looking towards.
I think it's largely dependent. I think we'll see, depending on, future elections, whether or not the capitulation we've seen from a lot of organizations, and some of the shifts in their policies is actually a result of them, coming to terms with reality, or if it's just a temporary pseudo capitulation until they have a more favorable administration in office who's not going to pursue them, for instance, like the Texas Children's Hospital. I tend to be a little more pessimistic about this aspect. I think, there is a large contingent of these people, who are true believers in gender affirming care, and they don't care about the evidence. They just want to affirm only. It's about, individual embodiment goals. I mean, that's kind of the direction a lot of this was going in anyway, where it doesn't even matter if you have dysphoria. Like, everyone should just be able to pursue their embodiment goals, at have it covered by their health insurance. Um, I don't think a lot of these people have changed their minds. Again, they're kind of the true believer type. Um, so we could potentially see a reversion back to more crazier times, but at least the scientific evidence is moving in the right direction. Hopefully, society doesn't diverge too far from that, because with that delta between what the evidence actually says and what society is going with, that's when you get a lot of problems.
Yeah, I think we're getting a lot of questions, just so that both of you can see, of people who are thinking, what can I share with my patients in session? Um, and then thinking about resources for that. And I think, Ilya, so you don't have to repeat yourself, I think the standard is that, if you can justify it clinically under normal clinical justifications for what you're doing, it's protected speech, even if other professionals would disagree with you. Um, and but the other question is kind of, are there, Colin, would you recommend any specific resources that have citations that clinicians can use if they were going to share these with a patient or a patient's family member about, potential short and long-term costs of medicalizing, for example? I do,
Yeah. I would direct a lot of people to the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine website. I think it's just segm.org. Um, and it might also seem daunting, but it's really not because there's a great summary in the beginning of it. The HHS, document on pediatric gender dysphoria. Um, Again, it's that systematic review of systematic reviews, and it has a really great introduction that lists all of them in a very systematized way. Um, Reading the whole document might be a bit daunting for a lot of people, but again, there's like a condensed version in the beginning of it that is very readable. And I think people can start there if they want to start looking at the evidence. And I think it's the most comprehensive document ever put together on all of the studies, on gender affirming care. So that's a good place to go.
Yeah. Um, we have a couple far-reaching questions, and I can try to think through them with both of you. But um, is there a way to slow um, reflexive affirmation in K through 12 classrooms? Um, it seems like that's interesting because the ruling didn't touch the public school system, but it does seem that similar policies in a public school system would apply. Would it be?
And there are counselors in public schools.
Right.
The Supreme Court recently declined a couple of cases, one out of California, one out of, I forget where, Florida, I think, where local school boards, because of course this is controlled by localities, not necessarily by the state itself, have policies promoting secret social transition where you don't tell the parents and things like this. And even though there was an earlier ruling on the emergency docket, the Mirabelli case, where they blocked a certain kind of egregious practice in another school district in California, they for some reason did not take up these other cases because they keep cropping up. It's So the law is in flux about those kinds of things, if that's what the question is really directed towards.
Wait, say that last part one more time.
The law is in flux. So
Okay.
there's rulings going in different directions about not telling parents about their child's gender issues at school.
Yes. So there's a lot more to happen, it sounds like, on the legal front
On the educational front,
the
yeah.
education front, and um, and a lot more data to come in. And then it also does seem like really having a robust question about what this looks like in practice for therapists is also a conversation to continue having
And
too.
so, to the extent that there are licensed therapists or licensed counselors in schools, then I would refer you to your professional obligations about interaction with minors and duty to report to parents and things like that.
Yeah. This might be a far afield but I don't know, it might be on your mind too. So I'm curious your thoughts. If you have, this will be the last question. I know we're gotta wrap up, but do you have thoughts about strategy moving forwards for people who want to make sure that we're engaging in best practices here? Suggestions for how people might want to approach it, where they can affect change most meaningfully? You might not, but I thought, Ilya.
Um, where they can affect change most meaningfully. Well, I mean, this in this context, it's within your professional organizations, I suppose. Um, to the effect that you're bringing new evidence or affecting standards of care or these sorts of things. There's a bunch of questions about how this issue has swept across the profession, unlike, anything ever. Yeah, I don't know, this kind of moral panic or what have you. So just, in many, well, you know better than I, you all know better than I, these psychological studies that if there's, one or two dissenters, even in a large group, that's a very different dynamic than if people stay mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm glad we brought up the issue with schools because it is not just primarily in the therapist's office that kids are exposed to these ideas. That might be one of one context, but I think most kids are exposed to it on social media. They're exposed to it in the classroom as well. And I mean, I think this is in a way it gives a lot of parents power in this sense that they don't have to be totally helpless, because they're not therapists. They can't just, change. It's not like they just need to, make therapists change how they practice this type of stuff. But it could help for parents to know that there are things they can do. They can get out and try to, join school boards and that type of thing. They can organize individually to try to enact the change that they want at the local level as much as possible. So I think everybody has a part to play in doing this. It's not just what policies and individual practices therapists do, but it's we have to pursue like it's a full court press. It's every context that this stuff is being implemented, and I think everyone can probably do something in their immediate surroundings to fight it.
All right. Thank you both. Brilliant, very, very helpful conversations. I hope as many people see it as can. And just for anybody else in attendance, if you are a mental health professional, join Open Therapy Institute, or if you're looking for a therapist or know people are, please send them to us. We have a vetted list of over 300 therapists. We're in 48 states. So we have somebody most likely licensed in your state. And thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Colin.